Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video and welcome to episode 8 of the Underdogs of Raiding. That's right, we're already on episode 8 of this wonderful series, and today we're going to cover a class that has both a bright side and a very dark side. I'm talking about the Priest, or more specifically, the Shadowpriest. Oh yeah, the face melter, the bringer of pain in PvP, the master of shadow damage. So let's once again go back to 2004, where we find ourselves in the beginning stages of WoW. Now, unlike many classes who were considerably weak in PvP, so to say, Shadowpriests were actually quite potent right from the get-go. Sure, rogues still dominated in early WoW, but Shadowpriests weren't exactly easy targets, and they were able to put up a good fight against almost every other class. In PvE though, well, things were quite a bit different. You see, in the early stages of classic WoW, priests were like shamans, druids and paladins forced to go holy most of the time, as that was considered to be the superior spec, and thus they were doomed to heal for a very long time in classic WoW's lifespan. If you would go shadow though, this would be one of the builds you could make way back in 2004. What's interesting in these talents is that there are some things here that not many people know of, including focused casting, a spell in the discipline tree that would prevent you from losing any cast time for 8 seconds, which, considering how big of a deal pushback was in classic WoW, was actually a nice little talent to have. Up in the Shadow Tree, not much is different in this era of WoW, apart from improved Vampiric Embrace not being there, which we'll see later in this video. Sadly for the Shadow Priest, they were often excluded from raids, as people back then didn't really see the utility a Shadow Priest brought, and considering the fact that they went out of mana very quickly, they almost always preferred to bring a Holy Priest for extra healing, or just a Warlock if they needed an extra damage dealer. It has to be said that yes, in PvP they were quite powerful, but unfortunately in PvE they were almost always forced to respec and heal. Let's move forward a bit to the later stage of vanilla, where we find ourselves with this talent tree. In this stage of the game, a basic PvE shadow spec would look something like this. The main focus of this build is utility, and the talents that show that the most are Shadow Weaving and Vampiric Embrace. So what did these two do? Well, Shadow Weaving gave you, with 5 talent points, a 100% chance to increase the shadow damage against a target by 3% with every shadow spell you cast, and this would stack up to 5 times. So yes, that's 15% extra shadow damage to everyone who's attacking the target. That got people thinking, wait a minute, Warlocks do shadow damage, and with 40-man raids we always have a bunch of them in our raid. What if we bring just one Shadow Priest to each and every single raid, even if it's just for that 15% extra damage to our Warlocks? And there you go. The Shadow Priest support class was born, because every hardcore raiding guild I've seen who was progressing through Ankh-Raj and Naxx made sure they always had a Shadow Priest in their group, cause 15% extra damage to a handful of damage dealers was huge. To no one's surprise, Shadow Priests became a Warlock's best friend, but Shadow Priests had another trick up their sleeve. That trick was Vampiric Embrace. This was applied to the target, and 20% of all shadow spell damage you did will be transferred into healing for all party members. So not only were Shadow Priests doing damage on their own, they increased the damage for the Warlocks, and they healed everyone in their own group. Even on today's private servers, having one Shadow Priest in your raid is a total no-brainer. So that sounds all nice and fancy, but of course there's still a few problems. One being the fact that just like in the earlier stages of the game, Shadow Priests were still having a lot of issues with going out of mana way too soon, so any Shadow Priest who was serious about raiding always had to bring a ton of consumables to every raid. Think of mana potions, dark runes, and a bunch of other stuff. Second of all, I talked about one Shadow Priest in every raid. Not a couple of them, just one. This meant that even though that one Shadow Priest you know gets welcomed with open arms, the rest of them had no place in that raid, which meant spots for Shadow Priests in raids were very scarce on every server. So looking back at this era, it's good that people started to acknowledge just how amazing a Shadow Priest can be and the buffs they bring. But unfortunately on their own they still lacked longevity and still had a hard time joining a raid as just a damage dealer. But like many other classes, the next expansion will be a new opportunity for them to try and hang with the big boys. Which means we're now going to move on to the Burning Crusade era of WoW. Now with the new era, the Shadowpriest got a few extra talents and some extra skills that were welcomed with open arms. First, let's talk about the new spells they got in the Burning Crusade. One of these spells was the talent Misery, which meant that as soon as a Shadowpriest would cast Shadow Word Pain, Mind Flay or Vampiric Touch on the target would then take an additional 5% extra damage. That's right, not only did they increase the shadow damage taken by 15%, they now have an extra 5% damage taken for all schools of damage. This meant that Warlocks would get a total of 20% extra damage. Just when you think the Shadowpriest couldn't be any kinder to Warlocks, here they are giving a total of 20% extra damage. And last but definitely not least, they got Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch worked kinda the same way as Vampiric Embrace, but instead of gaining health, you would gain extra mana. Exactly, after years of Shadowpriest having major mana issues, Blizzard started to address this with this talent and a spell that any odd priest could get, Shadow Fiend. Shadow Fiend was basically a pet that you could summon every couple of minutes, and every time it did melee damage to the target, you would gain mana. So it's obvious Shadowpriest got a lot of love in the Burning Crusade, and the mana issues were addressed. However, did that fix the suboptimal DPS and their mana issues? Well, today our featured guest is going to say a few words about that. You see, our featured guest for today is someone who raided on a Burning Crusade private server as a priest for a considerable amount of time, and is also one of the friends that got me back into playing World of Warcraft on a private server. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the one and only Rizzanti.
Hello everybody, Rizzanti here to tell you a little bit about my experiences playing WoW, more specifically playing Shadowpriest, and more specifically playing Shadowpriest in the Burning Crusade. I've tried most expansions in World of Warcraft. I found Burning Crusade to be the most entertaining by far. There's something about the difference in skill set between classes that was not seen again in later patches. I did not start out as a Shadowpriest. I started out as a Protodim, which is also a lot of fun because it allows you to actually drag people through various instances. But I wanted to have a caster, and so I picked a Shadowpriest, unknown of what it actually would do and what the amount of damage would be at that time. And I was quite surprised to find out that it's not actually a DPS class in the same way as other DPS are. The amount of utility that you get as a Shadowpriest is enormous, which also means that the amount of deeps that you're going to get is slightly less to make up for such utility. Don't expect to find yourself high on the DPS meters during any boss encounters. Where you can do some serious damage is during trash packs, where throwing your dots on all the mobs around allows you to actually do a lot of damage. The lack of damage on boss encounters is quite straightforward. Most importantly, both your dots and your Mind Flay could not actually crit. This was changed in the later expansions, but during Burning Crusade this means that your total DPS output would be lower compared to other classes, especially in the endgame. Then why on earth would you take any Shadowpriest along? Well, that's because the amount of mana returned in boss fights was quite tremendous. In total, I've seen myself do as much as 10k mana return in a single battle, which is a full recuperation of the mana that most healers had at that time. This means that people are capable of throwing a lot more spells. It makes the whole boss encounter a lot easier to do. This sort of utility was essential for Burning Crusade, which meant that most raids would take at least one, but most of the times two Shadowpriests to supply the amount of mana that's necessary to actually keep encounters going at high speed. In fact, playing a Shadowpriest well means that you have the largest mana recovery of any moves in the game, except for maybe Inner Fate or Evocation, which are single player. PvP as a Shadowpriest was something different altogether. The amount of sustained damage that you can do from the very first global cooldown was impressive, and on top of that, the CCs with both the AoE Fear and the Silence allowed you to actually melt targets away while having the healer stand idly by. However, it was pretty hard to escape as a target, because you didn't have Dispersion yet, which came in the Wrath of the Lich King, which made you a pretty easy target and mostly the first choice of most classes playing against you. One of the most entertaining aspects for me as a Shadowpriest in Burning Crusade was the ease at which I could collect gear. If a piece of gear had more spell damage than the one I was currently wearing, it was better, which remains the case until very late in the game at the end of tier 6, when you can start getting some haste. Gearing up as a Shadowpriest is not always fun. Not all groups are willing to take along a DPS that's not actually doing a lot of DPS if there are no worries for the amount of mana. This would have made gearing up hard if it wasn't for the fact that the Burning Crusade had a shitload of epics ready for you if you simply got tailoring.
And thank you for that brief overview of the Shadowpriest in the Burning Crusade, Rizzanti. To summarize everything a bit, I think it's safe to say that the Shadowpriest in the Burning Crusade had a lot of utility, which was their main focus in raids. They also did some decent damage, but never excelled like, let's say, a Shadow Destro Warlock. PvP was pretty fun too, though you were a bit of a walking bullseye for many arena games. And last but not least, you're right in saying that tailoring helped a lot in the Burning Crusade for Shadowpriest. That sweet, sweet frozen shadowy set was in the mind of almost any Shadowpriest who was looking for some nice epics in that era of the game. And then we arrive at the Wrath of the Lich King era of the game. In this expansion, Shadowpriest had this talent tree to play around with. Few talents to note here is the new talent Twin Disciplines in the Discipline tree for 5% extra damage and healing done by your instant spells, Pain and Suffering, which allowed your Shadow Word Pain to stay on the target longer, Twisted Faith, which increased your spell power by 20% of your total spirit, and increases the damage done by your Mind Flay and Mind Blast by another 10% if your target had Shadow Word Pain on it, which it pretty much did all the time. Last but not least, we have Dispersion, a very handy talent, especially in PvP, which reduced damage done by 90%, and it could be cast while stunned, feared, or silent, and on top of that, it clears all snare and movement impairing effects, plus making you immune to them while Dispersion is active. Basically, this was a PvP trinket on steroids, and it only had a 2-minute cooldown, and even in PvE, it was very handy for when you were getting low health, and you knew the healer is too busy to throw you a quick heal, for instance. So, with some extra spells added to the arsenal of the Shadowpriest, how did things fare for them in this expansion? Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag. You see, the rotation of a Shadowpriest is far more complex as, let's say, an Elemental Shaman or a Destro Warlock, as they have so many dots and cooldowns to keep track of. This meant that the average Shadowpriest who didn't master the rotation was not really pulling everything out of that class and thus doing, well, average DPS at best. They weren't at the bottom of the DPS list, but with only some basic knowledge they kinda struggled to get to the top of the DPS charts. This is one of the reasons why Shadowpriest on Wrath of Lich King private servers are undervalued and underappreciated. There's a lot of Shadowpriests who just don't quite have that rotation down. But the few people that do, oh boy, that's a whole different story. Sure, it takes time, patience, and a lot of effort to master it, but once you got it down, they can become very competitive in terms of DPS. Sure, in endgame they still can't quite keep up with a well-geared Fury Warrior or Fire Mage, but they definitely have a chance to be at least in the top 10 of the DPS if you got that rotation down. That's really the story of the Shadowpriest in Wrath of Lich King. Not a whole lot of people rolled them, and only a fraction of people did actually got to unlock their full potential. In some way, they were still kind of an underdog, but this class is without a doubt extremely fun and very potent. Like I said, the rotation is much more complex, so it's very challenging to get this down. But once you do, you can show a lot of DPSers that you aren't just a poor man's warlock. That you aren't just there to buff the other people in the raid. You are here because you mastered this class. You are here because you are the master of darkness. And that's gonna do it for today. I hope you liked this episode of the Underdogs of Raiding, and I'll be back with another video soon. Until then, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel, and have a good one.